Welcome. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's 6 p.m. Daylight Saving Time, Australia, Wednesday, November the 30th. Good evening and welcome to all our participants. There's about 150 registered participants on this webinar. I'm journalist and has been Quentin Dempster. I acknowledge I'm still crucially engaged because, as you all know, no one gets out of this alive. If you're joining us from anywhere designated as Australian territory, I hereby acknowledge this is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. We're about to discuss Australia and the so-called China threat with two distinguished experts and observers, Hugh White and Michael Sainsbury. I'll introduce them shortly. This exchange has been facilitated by the civil society organisation Australians for War Powers Reform, established in 2012. AWPR was co-founded by the late Paul Barrett. We're moved by the fact that the Department of Defence recently honoured Paul Barrett for his decades of analytical and intellectual honesty and public service. Paul accompanied Prime Minister Bob Hawke on his February 1984 visit to China. He was later appointed Secretary of the Department of Defence. On Paul's death last year, AWPR co-founder, former diplomat, Japan and Asia specialist, multi-published author and academic Alison Bronowski took over to lead the organisation. AWPR's mission is to ensure that decisions to send Australia's sons and daughters to war, and in an age of intercontinental ballistic missiles, with such decisions putting our civilian populations at the gravest risk, are, barring emergencies, made only after full debate and vote by the Federal Parliament of Australia. So not just the Prime Minister deciding alone, or with those few ministers from the National Security Committee of the Cabinet. Just think of ScoMo's undeclared multi-ministerial ministries in this context. If you're not a subscriber to AWPR, please consider supporting this effort in collective responsibility and careful judgment. Think Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, all lethal follies and strategic misjudgments by our American friends and Australia. If our discussion provokes a pertinent question you want answered, please wait until you see us exhaust ourselves covering the latest issues and issues arising. Please use the Q&A facility on your desktop button on the Zoom desktop. Please use this rather than the chat feature, and I'll try to get to your question. Now, our guests. Hugh White is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at ANU and former Deputy Defence Secretary for Strategy. He was principal author of Australia's Defence White Paper 2000. There's currently another defence review underway by former Minister Stephen Smith and Defence Chief Angus Houston. AWPR made a submission which is on the website. If you haven't already read it, I recommend Hugh White's recently published quarterly essay, Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America. Michael Sainsbury is a man after my own heart, an independent journalist. Michael is a former China correspondent who has lived and worked in North, Southeast and South Asia. He's been writing about business, politics and human rights in Australia and the Indo-Pacific for 25 years. For News Corp outlets, the media outlets once known as Fairfax, Nikkei, and more recently, independent outlets, including Michael West Media. Thanks, Hugh and Michael, for your brain space. Let's talk about threat assessment, the latest. Quickly reassess the current threat of US war with China for us, please. China's President Xi Jinping 2 weeks ago had 3 hours with President Joe Biden and 32 minutes with Australia's brand new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. Biden said to Xi, the US doesn't seek a new Cold War, doesn't support Taiwan independence, does not want to contain Beijing. So what's this indicate? Everyone drop your weapons? Is this really the start of de-escalation? Why is Australia's Defence Minister out of step with this? Let's start with you, Hugh.
Well, thanks very much, Quentin. A great pleasure to be here. A great pleasure to be joining Michael on this platform. And I just want to recognise the comments you made about Paul Barrett. I was, of course, a colleague of Paul's in Defence. He was my boss when I was Deputy Secretary there, and his loss is a very sad one. He had a great contribution to make to Australia. And it's a great opportunity to talk about this very important subject. Look, of course, it's always good when people talk. And so the fact that Xi Jinping and Joe Biden had their first face-to-face meeting since Biden became president just a couple of weeks ago, as you said, the fact that the meeting went for 3 hours, which was pretty significant, the fact that they did appear to at least come out of it with a meeting with good tone, that's all good news. But I don't think we should make a mistaken judgment that it's really good news, because I don't think and nothing they said really goes to the fundamentals of the differences between them, and therefore doesn't go to the fundamentals of the risk of a war between the US and China over Taiwan. And the reason for that is very simple. Taiwan is, of course, an enormously complex and important issue in its own right, about the future of Taiwan's democracy and so on. But it's also important when we're assessing the significance of the Taiwan issue for America, for China, and for Australia, to recognise that there's much more at stake than just the future of Taiwan, though that's very important in itself. You know, if the US and China go to war over Taiwan, it will no more be about Taiwan than the First World War was about the assassination of the Archduke. Of course, you know, it was a bit about the assassination of the Archduke, but we all know that fundamentally it was about the way in which the great powers of Europe at that time were wrestling about their respective places in a new international order, because the balance of power had changed with Germany's rise and all that sort of stuff. Now, there's an uncomfortably close analogy with the situation we face today. What drives the risk of war between America and China is that the Taiwan issue has become, if you like, the token, the kind of testing ground for the quite contradictory ambitions of these two countries. China wants to become the dominant power in the Western Pacific. America wants to remain the dominant power in the Western Pacific, and they can't both get what they want. And they don't so far, despite the sorts of conversations we've seen, for example, a couple of weeks ago between the two presidents, they don't so far seem serious about trying to reconcile their differences. And this is a very fundamental difference. These are the world's two strongest states competing as to which of them is going to be the dominant power in the world's most dynamic region. That is a huge issue. It's a kind of issue over which great powers have, you know, throughout history gone to war with one another. And so I think the risk that it will come to war over Taiwan remains quite high. Whether it actually happens depends on how things develop in Beijing and how things respond in Washington, and we can probably unpack that a bit further if you like. But the underlying sort of the geopolitical contest between America and China over their status in the Western Pacific, and the role of Taiwan as the fulcrum of that contest, that remains unchanged by anything that we've seen over the last couple of weeks.
We'll get into that again shortly, as you mentioned, Hugh. Michael, let's hear from you. What's your risk assessment?
Look, I think she's probably fairly spot on. The thing that I think is probably worth mentioning is that I think it's not just the Western Pacific really that this is about. It's really about the way that China is trying to reshape the global rules-based order that's sort of we've had since the end of the Second World War. It's, you know, it's formed its own. It's got the Asia Infrastructure Bank. It's got the Belt and Road program, which is kind of has been its framework for its foreign policy, stretching out into Asia and into Central Asia. And it's got the Shanghai Cooperation Group, which you would know about, which includes, interestingly, India, which is also in the Quad. So China's kind of slowly trying to build up its own set of institutions. And I think that again is the thing that's playing into this competition between China and the US. It's not necessarily about the Western Pacific, but it's a little bit broader about the way the world works. And, you know, it's interesting that China's got a lot of influence in Africa. It's got growing influence in Latin America. And I think she is right when he says that Taiwan has really become a bit of a token, in as much as it seems to be the flashpoint of this clash of ideologies, if you like.
Michael, Australia recognised, just get this into some historical context for our Australian, we've got about 150 people on this webinar. Australia recognised the Communist Party's 1949 foundation of the People's Republic of China in 72. The US recognised in 79 under Jimmy Carter after President Nixon's famous visit to Mao Zedong in 72. The status of Taiwan as an indivisible part of China seemed to be accepted, like for the British colony, Hong Kong. Now the world's democracies are being called to support Taiwan in the event of an armed invasion by China. So it's democracy versus authoritarianism, the clash of ideologies, as you indicated. Would you recommend war to repel China to save the human rights of 25 million people and Taiwan's democracy?
I don't look. I think at this stage, I would be unlikely that America would probably. I think that Taiwan would end up looking a little bit more like the Ukraine, where it becomes a bit more of a proxy war. The US provides arms to the Ukraine, Australia, Japan. I think that's probably if it happened now, that's probably what would happen. I don't know what you think there, Hugh.
Well, I'm asking, what should Australia do? Because Peter Dutton's already.
I think it would be foolish of Australia to go to support a war, an all-out war with China. I think it's ridiculous. Yeah. I mean, China. We have to, one of the things we have to accept is that China's economic power is growing, and China's influence is growing in the region. And if you look at what happened, if you look at ASEAN and we had the ASEAN meeting recently. Countries like Indonesia are kind of asking us to accept that China's influence in the region is growing. It wants us to be able to help to balance that influence with the US, but I don't think anyone else in the region wants us to go in on the side of the US. And
the reason I'm asking this question, although Albo hasn't said anything, of course, along those lines, but Dutton has. He's indicated it would be inconceivable that we wouldn't support the US in an action if the US chose to take that action. Hugh?
Look, yeah, I agree, Quentin. This is a really important question. My view is that when you think about war and peace, you always have to weigh two sides of the scale. On the one side of the scale on this question is the very significant fact of Taiwan's status, the fact that it's developed this very vibrant democracy over the last 25 years. The fact that some people would argue that if China can take Taiwan, then they might move on and take other countries. This might just be the first step. And of course, the significance of supporting the United States as an ally, as we've so often done before. And they're all arguments you can debate about, but they're respectable arguments to have on one side of the scale. On the other side of the scale, of course, you have to ask yourself, what kind of war are we talking about? And the reason why I argue that we should not go to war with China in support of the United States over Taiwan is simply that would be, I think, a very large war, which we're not going to win. And, one of the things that disturbs me about the way these issues are discussed, including, as you mentioned, by Peter Dutton, and I also think, although Morrison as Prime Minister was more guarded in the language he used, but I think Morrison was clearly leaning the same way, is the idea that they pay attention to the arguments as to why we should go, those three arguments I just mentioned, but they pay no attention to the question, what kind of war are we talking about, and are we going to win it? Now, we've gone to war a few times in the last few decades. You touched on them yourself, Quentin, earlier on. We think Vietnam, we think Iraq, we think Afghanistan. These are wars that failed, but they were actually, even Vietnam was, relatively speaking, a small war. Now, you might say a small war in which 50,000 Americans are killed and untold hundreds of thousands, millions of Vietnamese are killed. You might say, how can I call that a small war? Well, because it is small compared to the war we'd face if the US and China went to war. This would be World War III. And one of the reasons I say that is that I don't believe either side can win a swift victory in this war. That it used to be the case until maybe 10, 15 years ago that the United States had a good chance of winning a war over Taiwan quickly and easily because it had such overwhelming superiority in air and naval power. But the Chinese have well and truly expanded their own air and maritime capability, air and naval capability, to the point where they can give the United States a very good run for their money. Now, that doesn't mean that the Chinese would win. It means that neither side would win the conventional war. That means the conventional war drags on, and I think it produces a real risk that the war escalates to a nuclear exchange.
The
I think
reason,
we
thanks.
need to be terribly conscious of the fact that these are nuclear powers.
We're terribly conscious of that, Hugh. The reason I've also raised this is because the Pentagon has got its annual assessment, which is publicly released, and it brave an escalation through a bloody collision or accident in the Taiwan Strait. And then this is the unknown. So as you say, Hugh, it depends on the circumstances of what precipitates war. Michael?
Yes, it does.
Just on that nuclear point, there was a piece, I think, in The Economist last couple of days that was talking about China has been building up its own nuclear arsenal. It had been hitherto pretty happy with sitting on 200 or 300 nuclear weapons, where the US and the Russians have about 1,500 each. But it had I think it's decided that it wants to play the same game and escalate its nuclear arsenal, which then begs the question of what happens when the START treaty finishes in, I think it's 2026. You probably know better than me, Hugh. And are we looking at a situation where we have a sort of a tripartite nuclear buildup, which would be really pretty horrific in the context of a potential dispute over Taiwan?
So your clear advice to Australia, and of course your analysts and observers, but your clear advice to Australia is we should flag that Australia should not become involved in a war over Taiwan.
Yes.
That would be my advice, yeah. And I think Peter Dutton was really quite out of line escalating that issue, because we don't have any treaty obligations to Taiwan. We don't have any treaty obligations with the US towards Taiwan. So there's nothing that we're committed to at all. It's really just, he was freelancing a bit, I think, Hugh.
Well, I think it was. I think there was a fair bit of politics in that. I think it's quite clear that the previous government was very happy to use the rise of China and the Taiwan as a pressure point over the issues connected with the rise of China as a domestic political artifact. It may be that Dutton also had thought the issue through carefully and had reached a sober conclusion on that issue. But I think that's pretty unlikely. I think he was playing politics with the issue, and I think that's shockingly irresponsible.
Listen, Joe Biden keeps answering reporters' shouted questions about that the US would intervene militarily to repel China over Taiwan, later walked back by the State Department. What's the truth here? Is this just bluffing? It's rhetoric. I know it was before their visit, their talk, President Xi and President Biden.
I think the US has shown you've got to sort of, we've had the Trump years were pretty confusing, and I think they've been trying to settle themselves down since then a bit. I think that they internally aren't quite sure. That's the message I'm getting. I'm not sure about you, Hugh.
Look, I think there are two possibilities. One is that Joe Biden has just made a mistake 4 times. That is, the official US policy is that the United States does not say whether or not it would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. And that's a policy which goes all the way back to the recognition of China back in 1979 that Quentin mentioned. It's called a policy of strategic ambiguity, and it's been upheld by every administration for 40 years. And then, as you mentioned, Joe Biden has now, on 4 separate occasions, when asked, or even sometimes even spontaneously without being asked, has abandoned strategic ambiguity and said in words of one syllable, we would defend Taiwan. And every time the State Department or his own officials in the White House walk back and say, no, there's been no change in policy. So there's 2 possibilities here. Either Joe Biden is just getting it wrong 4 times in a row, which is possible, or the Americans are trying to do something. And I think the more likely explanation is that they're trying to half walk back from strategic ambiguity. That is, they're trying to raise doubts in China's mind, in Xi Jinping's mind, about whether America would in fact defend Taiwan or not. They're trying to strengthen the impression in Beijing that America would defend Taiwan. And they feel the need to do that because they understand that their deterrence is weaker because of that shift in the military balance that we talked about before. In the old days, strategic ambiguity worked because America didn't need to say it absolutely categorically would defend Taiwan, because everyone knew that the Americans could defend Taiwan easily. So the likelihood that they would was pretty high. But the harder it becomes for America to defend Taiwan, the harder America has to work to persuade the Chinese that they would. And therefore, I think what we're seeing is a sort of a half step back from strategic ambiguity as a deliberate policy. And that I think is the more likely explanation, rather than just imagining that Joe Biden's got his lines wrong 4 times in a row.
Thanks for that lovely clarity, Hugh. John Tan, one of our observers, said President Biden has said that the US should not lightly fight directly with Russia because that would lead to a world war. Does this logic also apply to a war with a nuclear power like China, making a US-China war less likely? Hugh, first.
Well, that's the conundrum, because I think the analogy, drawing the analogy with the way Joe Biden has responded to the invasion of Ukraine is pretty instructive, actually, because as the questioner said, Joe Biden was absolutely clear he is not going to send forces in to defend Ukraine directly because it would lead to World War III. And I think he's quite right about that, by the way. Now, the fact is that the risk of World War III is just as high with China as it is with Russia over Ukraine. The possibility of that war spinning into a major nuclear exchange is just as high. And I think it's therefore strange, to put it politely, that Biden is talking up the likelihood of America going to war with China over Taiwan, while he's talking down the likelihood of America going to war with Russia over Ukraine, particularly when you remember that, and Quentin, you touched on this before, Taiwan has a very odd status. When countries like Australia and the United States establish diplomatic relations with the people of Republic of China, we de-recognize Taiwan. We as countries do not recognize Taiwan as an independent state. We don't actually accept China's claim that it's part of China. We recognize China's claim that it's part of China. That's a bit of diplomatic footwork, if you like. But Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations. It doesn't have all that sort of sacred status as an independent state, which Ukraine does have. So the moral and political and diplomatic arguments in favor of defending Taiwan are weaker than the arguments in favor of defending Ukraine. So all of that leads one to think that America would probably not go to war with China over Taiwan. On the other hand, on the other side of the ledger, is the fact that Biden keeps saying they will, and Biden keeps giving the impression to everyone, to Australia, to the Taiwanese themselves, to its other allies in Asia, to other countries in Asia whose support it seeks in relation to China, like the Southeast Asians, they keep on indicating to the world that they are going to defend Taiwan. And so if they back off from defending Taiwan, that's going to destroy their credibility of the Western Pacific and deliver primacy in the Western Pacific, and more broadly, for the reasons that Michael touched on, to China.
Thank you, Michael. You're a journalist. How do we help the Australian people get a better handle on this? Because Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch and their outlets aren't exactly helping with good journalism to tell the public what's really going on. I mean, a recent Australia Institute public opinion survey showed, quote, more Australians think that China will attack Australia than Taiwanese believe China will attack Taiwan.
Yeah, well, it was quite interesting. I came back to Australia about 2.5 years ago because of COVID, and had lived in Asia for 11 years. And the narrative in the Australian media had gone from China's this fantastic country, and this is in the Murdoch press that I used to work for. China's this fantastic country that's making us rich. We're trading with China. We don't speak about their human rights. You know, they're great. Let's forget about everything else. They're making us money. Two, China's evil. China's a dreadful place. we hate China, we're worried that it's all yellow peril again. It was really quite kind of strange to see that turnaround in probably about 6 or 7 years from when, I mean, I guess it's worth remembering that the coalition signed the free trade agreement under Tony Abbott, and it was all kumbaya with China then things turned on a dime within about 3 or 4 years. So the Murdoch press, I think, has a fair bit to answer to, but everyone's jumped on board this China threat narrative, and China's not interested in invading Australia. You could argue that it already has. I mean, it's there's a huge diaspora of Chinese people here. We welcome them. Chinese money has helped Australia sell a lot of minerals back to China and everywhere else. We've got our universities that only going because of Chinese students, because the government's poured all the money. So that model of the US model of economic imperialism, certainly something that China's been following with regards to countries like Australia, Canada, and all the rest. So they're not going to, they don't need to invade us.
Thank you. Now, gentlemen, let's talk about deterrence, Australia and the United States. Our country may well have been invaded by the Japanese in the 1940s if it wasn't for the blood sacrifices of our American friends, Guadalcanal, the great naval battles of Midway, and specifically the Battle of the Coral Sea. As the son of a Second World War soldier, I always remember Dad saying, Quentin, without the Yanks, Australia would have been taken over by the Japanese. So we're very grateful to the United States and have been loyal to that friendship ever since, in good and bad, mostly bad, in the lethal follies that I mentioned earlier. What's the price we're paying for unquestioning loyalty? Hugh.
Well, I think that's a good way to frame it, Quentin, because the fact is, whatever happens, our loyalty shouldn't be unquestioning. Alliances work. You want to be quite unsentimental about alliances. Alliances work when they serve your interests. Now, our alliance with the United States has worked very well for Australia for a long time. It's had some bad moments, of course, but overall, I think you could say going back to 1941, through those dark days that you mentioned in the early 1940s, but also more broadly, I think Australia has benefited from the way that American power in Asia, notwithstanding the mistakes and missteps and so on, American power has stabilized Asia, has kept Asia safe and harmonious, made it possible for Australia to make its way in Asia, made it possible for China to grow, made it possible for Japan to recover from the Second World War, and provided the foundation for Australia's engagement with Asia and the prosperity that's flowed from that. And that's all been good. But the fact is that the circumstances in which that worked well have now changed. And this really goes to the point that Michael was making. What we're still struggling to wake up to is the strategic consequences of the extraordinary economic transformation we've seen in China over the last 30 years. The fact is that China has now got, on the most relevant measure, purchasing power parity, the biggest economy in the world. And with that great wealth goes great power, and with that great power goes great ambition. China is no longer content to live under US primacy the way it has been in the past. And that's the reason why Australia's assessment of China has been transformed in the way that Michael described, is that for a long time we kidded ourselves that China was going to grow strong and wealthy, but was still going to accept American leadership, the international order, the regional order that we liked, that served us well.
And they changed their stance to get it in a timeline, Hugh. They changed their stance in 2014. The Americans responded in 2017.
Well, I would say that actually the Chinese had this policy of bide and hide, bide your time and hide your power, don't claim leadership. So for a long time, as their economy grew, they encouraged everyone to think that they'd be happy to live under US primacy. I think the historians will judge it was about 2009 and 2010 when that changed.
Right, earlier.
And so when the Chinese policy changed, and you can see that the Americans starting to respond with things like President Obama's pivot to Asia, which was 2011. Australia was still going along with the old line that so many prime ministers repeated: Australia doesn't have to choose between America and China. Well, the implication being we don't have to choose between America and China because they won't really be strategic rivals. But now I think it was 2017 was the point at which both America and Australia changed. 2017, the US national security strategy issued under Trump identified China as a strategic rival. Those were the words, strategic rival, for the first time. And 2017 was also the year that Malcolm Turnbull started getting antsy about China. There was all of the stuff about political interference and the political interference legislation that was brought in at the end of 2017. Yeah. So I think 2017 was the swing year for both of them.
I just want to read this from your essay, Hugh, for our audience. Today, and you've made that point already, but this is the detail. Today, China's economy is 19% of global GDP and America's is 16%. By 2035, China will be at 24% and America just 14%. So the raw economic power is shifting, and that's shifting China's stance. We have to deal with that. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, look, that Hugh would probably even say now that may have been over-egging it, because we're not quite yet. Look, China and American economies probably about the same size, probably will continue to be about then. I think that China is facing some serious economic problems. We can see it happening at the moment, and they're being exacerbated by COVID, but they have some structural problems. You know, they're trying to unwind their property bubble, and they've got this dreadful demographic problem coming up where their population is going to start to shrink. And the old adage is that China, when they say that China's going to get old before it gets rich, what sort of internal problems that causes, and how that I guess how that mirrors itself out to the rest of the world could be a problem as well. You know, authoritarian regimes have a tendency when there's trouble internally, and we can look at Russia at the moment, to project out and cause a distraction outside the country. So I think that's probably another risk that we have to layer into the potential conflict that might come. That China might do something, not necessarily because America's become more problematic for it, it's because it's got internal problems.
Let's talk about AUKUS. What's right with it? Is anything right with it? What's wrong with it, Hugh?
Well, I think it's helpful to look at AUKUS in two quite different ways. One is it's a capability proposal, that is how we acquire submarines, and the other is it's an expression of strategic alignment. I think it's a mistake on both grounds. It's a mistake as a capability decision, because I don't think nuclear-powered submarines is the right capability choice for Australia. We need submarines, I believe. I'm a great fan of submarines, but I think the costs and the risks and the complexities of operating nuclear submarines and the delays in bringing them into service outweigh the operational advantages that nuclear-powered submarines have over conventionally powered submarines. So as a straight defence policy choice, I think it makes no sense at all to go for nuclear-powered submarines. We'd be much better off trying to build a new fleet of conventional submarines, although I was never any great fan of the French projects that was in place before the AUKUS deal was made. So I think it's a bad decision as a capability development argument. But I also think that it's something much more than that, and it was very clear in the way it was announced, the sort of theatre around it, and that is that it was intended, I think, on all sides, certainly intended both in Washington and Canberra, as a very clear statement of Australia's strategic alignment with the United States as it confronts China. Now, of course, you might say there's always, you know, and you touched on this before, Quentin, you know, the ANZUS goes back to 1951 and all that sort of stuff. We've been an ally for the United States as long as anyone can remember. But the fact is that for a long time, Australia has been quite cautious about how it positions itself in relation to the United States on the big issues in Asia. And it seemed that AUKUS was one of the steps that Australia's taken, in some ways the most important step, in which we really are saying to Washington, we are with you, come what may. I think there's, and we've seen some other significant steps, like that, for example, the reported decision, Four Corners had some material on this a month or so ago, for Australia to host B-52 aircraft out of Tyndall in the Northern Territory. Now, of course, we've been hosting US aircraft through Tyndall and Darwin for a long time, but this arrangement looks very operational. It looks like it's designed to support US combat operations, not training operations. So I think AUKUS it's seen strategically and diplomatically. It was a mistake because it encouraged the United States to expect that in the event of war with China, Australia would be with them. Now, I think Americans are now absolutely convinced of that. And so whilst we in Australia might think that we're going to have a debate when the time comes, I think in Washington, they believe the decision's already been made. They think we're with them. And I think that's got two bad consequences. The first is that will itself encourage America, if and when it faces the choice that Michael and I and you have been discussing. In other words, if and when the Chinese move against Taiwan, America has to make a decision as to whether to risk World War III or not, in terms of the conversation we're having before. Now, and one of the factors that will play into that was what will our allies in Asia do and what will they expect of us? And I think we are encouraging by so unambiguously expressing our commitment to support the United States in those circumstances, we're encouraging the United States to decide to go to war. And I think that would be a tragic mistake. It also means that if we decide against going, then we're going to be letting America down at the worst possible moment. That is the worst time to say to the Americans, sorry, we don't want to join you in this. Is when they're actually on the threshold of going. If we're not going to go to war with China over Taiwan, we should be telling the Americans now and not encouraging them to think contrary. And I think AUKUS sends exactly the wrong message in that regard.
Michael, can you respond to that? AUKUS, interoperability, more Marines in Darwin, B-52s in Tyndall, upgrade of Pine Gap, which is, this locks us in, doesn't it, to joining?
It really would seem to lock us in. And I guess going to the purposes of the whole war powers thing, it was sort of done without any consultation or any authority from the Australian voters either. I think it just sideswiped everyone. It was a ham-fisted thing to do in a way, because it sends not just the wrong message to China and the wrong message perhaps to the US as Hugh mentioned, but potentially, but also very much the wrong message to the rest of the region. I mean, Australia has sort of backpedaled from it. The Hawke Keating days of engaging with Southeast Asia. We sort of shrunk back from that to now we were suddenly now aligning with the Anglosphere again and forgetting about countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, which are very important countries when it comes to if we're interested in trying to talk China down and let China know that it's not a great idea to push too aggressively into the region. It's those countries like that are important that we should be sort of talking together with, rather than the US and the UK.
Given the increased military buildup of China, isn't this, gentlemen, part of necessary deterrence? I accept your point about the Anglosphere. It looks a bit racialist and sends the wrong message to China. But isn't this part of projecting a defensive capability, even an offensive capability? Don't mess with us. Well,
Quentin, I think as we face the reality that we're going to be living in an East Asia and a Western Pacific in which China is much, much more powerful than it has been before, and indeed is more powerful than any Asian power has ever been since European settlement of this continent, it's going to be very important for Australia to use all the instruments of statecraft, military and diplomatic and economic and whatever else we can find, to try and manage China's power and make sure that we don't become too subject to China's influence. And I might say the same is also going to be true in the future, not the distant future, with India. India is also a rising great power, and I think we make a mistake to see India purely in terms of the counterbalance to China. It's going to be an ambitious and influential great power in its own right. In that world, in that region, Australia is going to need to have much deeper and more effective diplomatic integration in the region with countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, exactly as Michael said, and I think we've really dropped the ball on that in the last decade or two. But we're also going to need to think much more carefully about our own defence, because until now, Australia has always assumed that if worst comes to the worst, America will be there for us. And I don't think that's an assumption we can any longer make. As America faces a rival as powerful as China is today, And notwithstanding the points that Michael makes about the difficulties that China has, I think it has got some difficulties, but it's still going to end up with an economy which is far bigger relative to the United States than any country has ever had since the United States became a global power itself 120 odd years ago. You know, China's economy is already now twice as large relative to America's as the Soviet Union's was on its best day. So this is an unprecedentedly formidable rival for the United States. We can't assume America is going to be there for us. We therefore need to build defence forces which can manage our own interests much more effectively than we have in the past. And one of the reasons why I think the nuclear submarine aspect of AUKUS is dumb is that I think because it's going to take them so long to arrive, if they ever do, and because they're going to be so hard to operate, and because we're not going to be able to afford very many of them, I don't think they're going to give us the deterrence we need. I think a much bigger fleet of much less expensive but still very capable conventional boats, more like the Collins we have at the moment, would be a better bet. I wrote a book about this a few years ago called How to Defend Australia, in which I set out what I thought was the right kind of approach for Australia to defend itself independently in this very different Asian century. And my argument there is we need something like 24 submarines, not 8 or 12.
Michael, what's your gratuitous advice to Stephen Smith and Angus Houston, who hopefully will be watching this, if not now, on the video?
Look, defence hardware is probably my weakest suit, Quentin, but I think she's right. I mean, the lead times for these nuclear subs, you know, we've already talked about how quickly this thing's been moving over the last 5 to 10 years. To think that to wait 15 or 20 years for something to come, the world's going to be turned upside down by then. So,
do you really think they're going to address the gap in this defence review?
Hard to tell. I mean, I have to say I've never had a huge confidence in Stephen Smith, but there you are. He's a pretty ordinary foreign minister, but he did have Kevin hovering over the top of him. I think it was Hugh talks about 24 smaller subs, and I think there's also a big role for underwater autonomous drones and things like to be wrapped around all that sort of thing. There's a few people I speak to in the Navy, and they reckon that side of things is going gangbusters, and we're probably not spending enough money or time on it.
Hugh, Kevin Rudd, who
Yes.
Michael's just mentioned, has produced The Avoidable War, just out, and he says it's unmanaged. We're in a state of unmanaged strategic and economic competition, the euphemism that is used to try to get dialogue going. And that is helpful to frame this debate. But do you, Hugh, think that Smith and Houston will come up with something that will help us wind back where we are seem to be locked into at the moment?
Look, I think there's two parts of that, Quentin. I think on the broader strategic conversation, that is the question: how strongly do we align ourselves with the United States? Do we, as I think we are doing at the moment, fundamentally depend on the United States to solve our China problem for us by reasserting its leadership and repelling China's bid to become a more influential player in Asia, if you like, to restore the old US-led order that we know and love? I don't think Angus and Stephen are going to touch that issue. I think they've been basically told to leave those big strategic settings in place. And I think that's a mistake. I think, one of my reservations, one of my regrets, if you like, is that Labor has come into office as committed to that vision of Australia's future in Asia as their predecessors were. They don't talk about it in the leery language that Dutton used, but I think their fundamental strategic perception is the same. And I don't think Angus and Stephen are going to affect that. On the other hand, I do think there's a chance, and I'm crossing my fingers here, that they will understand that the nuclear submarine proposal is just too long term to be valuable. As Michael said, I mean, my estimate is that even if the first submarine is delivered on schedule in the early 2040s, and nothing ever goes according to schedule in a submarine project, but even if miraculously it does, we still wouldn't have 6 submarines until the mid 2050s. And of course, one submarine isn't a capability. It's like having one wheel on a car. You need 6 as an absolute minimum to do anything useful strategically. And so, the time frame for the nuclear powered submarines is just, strategically absurd. So I think what they might do, and this is just me hoping more than anything else, but I think what they might do is speculating, but I think they might suggest that the government should, in addition to pursuing this, I don't think they'll abandon the nuclear submarine thing. I think the government's made it clear that that's not up for debate, but they might well recommend that between the nuclear boats supposedly coming into service and now, we will build another class of interim conventional submarines. Now that will cost a huge amount of money. It will be extraordinarily demanding for the Defence Department. I think there are all sorts of questions about whether that's viable, but I'd much rather see them reach that conclusion than put all of our submarine eggs in the basket of a nuclear boat in the 2050s.
Gentlemen, we're wrecked in national debt after the pandemic. We've got an operational deficit out as far as the eye can see. Albanese's worried about being wedged not only on focus, but on taxation and revenue for our mighty nation. Michael, under all these circumstances we've been discussing, would you accept and recommend, as Kim Beazley has, that we have to radically increase defence expenditure comparative with GDP?
I don't think we're in a position to do that. I think there's other things.
We're broke. We haven't got any money.
No, we don't, and we've got an aging population. We've probably hit our peak wealth. There's a whole lot of social issues we've got to deal with, and without dealing with those properly, who cares if we've got defence if the country's going to collapse internally? There's a limit to how much money you can spend on defence, and I think there's a limit to how much people. I think there's a limit to how much the taxpayer is going to want to spend on defence. Frankly, I mean, we're moving up. Well, I think we've moved up to nearly 2%, which is what we should be up to, and we should be spending more money on research, R&D, and all sorts of things like that as a percentage of GDP rather than on defence. And
it's all based on a speculated threat that China will invade Australia. Hugh?
Or cause trouble in the region. I think just one point, Quentin, and Hugh, in terms of when the subs are arriving in the 2040s, I think we have to remember where China's got a very set time horizon for Taiwan, which is 2049, which is the 100-year founding of the Chinese Communist Party, the communists of modern China by Mao when they won the civil war in 1949, and it's widely seen that is within that envelope, but they want to sort Taiwan out. So they're going to sort Taiwan out before we get any nuclear subs, one way or the other.
I wanted to get Hugh on a defence expenditure. Should we lift Australia's defence expenditure comparative to GDP?
Look, it's a really important question, Quentin, and it's one of these huge choices that we have to make. But we need to understand just what's on both sides of that scale. When I mentioned before that I published this book on this question a couple of years ago, and in that book I had a sort of back of the envelope estimate, but still quite well developed back of the envelope estimate. But in order to build the forces that could allow us to defend Australia independently against the force of a major Asian power like China, we would have to spend something like 3.5% of GDP on defence compared to 2% at the moment. Now, that is a very significant expansion in how much we spend. It's also worth bearing in mind, though, that that's what we spent in the 50s and 60s. If you look at the Australia's defence spending in the 1950s and 1960s, it averaged about 3.5% across those 2 decades. So it's not unthinkable that we could do that, but it would require a huge sacrifice. And I think, the points that Michael made is right. There's a lot of other things we need to be spending money on. And I don't think Australia could sustain that kind of defence spending unless we were prepared to substantially increase the tax take. Now, that a lot of people think, oh God, that's unthinkable. Actually, Australia is still, in comparison with other OECD countries, for example, a relatively lightly taxed country. So I think we could, as a country, increase our taxes, but I don't think that's something we should do lightly. On the other hand, what's on the other side of that is that if we don't spend that kind of money, then we would find ourselves in a position where we would be in effect ceasing to be a middle power in Asia, at least in the military sense, and become a kind of a small power. And that means that whilst I would agree that the chances of China moving militarily against us are low, at least today, we don't know about the China 20 or 30 years from now, but the chance of the China we know today moving militarily against Australia directly is pretty low. The chance of it moving militarily against our close neighbours is pretty low. But if we choose not to spend that money, if we choose to stay at 2% of GDP, for example, we would not be able to do anything material to stop China if they chose to do that sometime in the 2040s or 2050s. And that's just a choice for Australia to make. We could take what I somewhat unkindly call the New Zealand option, which is to, you know, spend 1% of GDP and hope for the best. But of course, the difference between New Zealand and Australia is that they have Australia, and that's who they depend on. And if I'm right that the United States is probably not going to play as big a role in East Asia and the Western Pacific as we've been used to playing it in the past, if I'm right that we're going to have to depend more on ourselves, then we either decide to spend that extra dough and pay more taxes as a result, or spend less on other things, or we just say, okay, we're going to take that risk. And that I'm not sure that would be the wrong decision, but I think I don't think it's a decision we should make unknowingly, if you know what I mean. What worries me at the moment is that we're drifting into losing our middle power status because we keep on assuming America is going to solve the problem for us. And I think that's an incorrect assumption.
Thank you. Here's a question from Michael Smith, more a statement, I think. How plausible is it to undertake a defence strategic review, in the absence of a national security strategy, which Australia has not had since 2013? Surely defence is only part of a much broader and important national security strategy. I think, gentlemen, you could nod agreement with that?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, here's a question from Jenny. What role does DFAT play in all of this as advisor to government, especially recently with years of reduced funding and resourcing? Hugh?
Well, look, I think it's a really important point. I think one of the problems we have at the moment is in an era in which our international setting in Asia has become more and more complex and more demanding. The authority and capability of DFAT has been driven down by successive budget cuts, and I would also say by a succession of pretty weak and inadequate ministers. And as a result of that, our diplomacy in East Asia has really gone through the floor. I mean, again, echoing something that Michael said before, if you look at the focus and energy and excitement that surrounded Australia's relations with Indonesia, for example, back in the Hawke and Keating era, that's just disappeared. Now, I think Indonesia, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind, Indonesia, well before the middle of the century, Indonesia is going to have the 4th biggest economy in the world. It is going to be a great power itself. And yet Australia is treating Indonesia as if it's got the same strategic weight as Fiji. I'm not saying that Fiji is insignificant. I think it is. But, you know, we just don't give Indonesia nearly enough weight in our discussion. And I think rebuilding DFAT's capacity to really put diplomacy at the heart of the way we manage these issues is really critical. But I don't see that as being a choice between diplomacy on the one hand and defence on the other. I think you need both wheels on this bicycle. They're both important to enable us to manage what is going to be a more complex, more demanding, I think in many ways more dangerous international setting for Australia over the decades ahead than we've known well since the 1940s.
Michael?
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with Hugh more, but I mean, even in the decade and a half since I sort of went to China, it's been visible the running down of DFAT, the crimping of resources. I think we're ranked right near the bottom of the OECD table on the amount of the resources we put into diplomacy. And you know, dead right, we've had a series of very weak foreign ministers. We seem to have a better one this time around, who's very engaged and she has done some good things already in both the Pacific and Southeast Asia. And I think that Penny Wong's the right person at the right time, and probably, hopefully it's not too late. We've also had a few disasters in terms of people when they had put Catherine Campbell in for a year and a half, I think was a disaster, Hugh. running DFAT. So I think that is something we, and the relative resources that we need to put into DFAT to build it up is minimal compared to defence spending. So
yeah.
I think that really needs to be sorted out, and I'm sure Penny Wong will be pushing for it.
Thanks. I hope she's watching or she gets hold of this. Look, let's quickly go back to the other geopolitical hotspot, and it's going to change the nature of geopolitics in Ukraine. What role is Australia? I'm more worried about mission creep. What role is Australia playing in it? We're bankrolling Zelensky and the defense of Ukraine. This is a nightmare for Ukrainians, and Russia's sons and daughters in the military being killed in this conflict now. Is there an end in sight? What role is Australia playing in it? We have trainers being sent to work in the UK with Ukrainian military, as New Zealand does. Canada is reported to have trainers on the ground in Ukraine. Is there a danger of mission creep? How is this going to end? Hugh?
Who do you want to? Look, I think the situation in Ukraine is incredibly serious. I think people still don't quite understand how significant it is that we have Russia so directly and militarily challenging not just Ukraine's sovereignty as an independent state, but the whole established post-Cold War order in Europe. This is a really big deal, and I think it's entirely appropriate that Australia should play the kind of role we've been playing. But it's also terribly important not to make sure this doesn't escalate into a larger conflict. I think the risks of that are really quite high. And I therefore think Biden is quite right to have been so cautious about not allowing the support to Ukraine to sort of edge above a particular level. And I think actually, I'm often a critic of US statecraft, but I think the way that Washington has gone thus far and no further and have held the line, despite some pretty strong pressure from Zelensky, who's not bad at the public relations side of his job. I think that's actually been quite impressive. But you're right, making sure that this doesn't escalate into a Russia-America conflict is really critical. And that means eventually they're going to have to sit down and talk to Russia and eventually do a deal which acknowledges Russia's position as a great power in Europe. And that's something that people hate to say and hate to acknowledge, but that's the reality. It is a great power, if only because it has those 1,500 nuclear weapons that Michael referred to, and probably another 5,000 back in the storehouse. So we're going to have to do a deal with Russia eventually, and recognizing that and finding the right time to sit down with Russia and start talking is going to be very critical, and that's going to be very uncomfortable for the Ukrainians.
How the bloody hell does that happen? How do we break that? What's happening? How do we break the deadlock?
Well, I think in the end that it's a matter of Ukraine recognizing or developing a clear idea of how far it's prepared to push, how much it's prepared to suffer. And it's going to have to, the hard thing is that it's going to end up giving away some things it doesn't want to give away. That's the way power politics works. People hate saying that, but that's the reality.
Michael?
Yeah, I think that she is right. The Ukrainians are going to have to give something away. Everybody, in the end, everybody wants this to end, including the Russians. I think this winter will be very telling, and I think after that there will be probably some lines drawn, hopefully, and people will start to talk because. Again, Russia's internally, Russia's got a heap of problems itself as well. So it is a nightmarish situation, and there's already been a bit of a de facto recognition of Russia. The Crimea thing was just kind of accepted and swallowed. It's now trying it on again a bit, and we're going to have to give them a bit more, but they've got to realise that they're not going to get everything, and the Ukrainians are going to have to give something away, which is it's awful, right?
Well, thanks for making those points because this is so geopolitically important. A lot riding now. China has changed, although Xi has been with Putin and indicating all the way with Putin, but that's been walked back, Hugh, too, hasn't it? Xi Jinping is a little bit more reticent now.
Yes, I think there's always been some quite significant limitations on China's support for Russia, despite the sort of warm rhetoric that we saw before the invasion back in February of the sort of, unshakable alliance sort of thing. I think there's always been some limits, and I think Xi is probably very keen to distance himself from what looks like a very serious strategic failure by Putin.
Well, if only the president of China, Xi Jinping, would intervene and secure a negotiated settlement. We can only send him those vibes from dear old Australia. Gentlemen, you've been very generous with your time. We're going to end it here. I want to relay a message from Alison Bronowski, the president of Australians for War Powers Reform. She says the current inquiry, the Defence Strategy Inquiry, long promised by the ALP, will change nothing if it only recommends scrutiny and debate about how Australia goes to its next disastrous war. The Parliament can already scrutinise and debate what it isn't crucially required to do is to vote on it. And that's why the Australian for War Powers Reform has been so active. So, gentlemen, thanks again for joining us, and to all our participants. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. I think we've covered it pretty well. Please support the work of Australians for War Powers Reform by visiting their website, warpowersreform.org.au. You can also follow them on Twitter and Facebook. The Digital Revolution, still owned by Elon Musk, Twitter, and Zuckerberg, Facebook, but it's transforming the information age. It's transformative and empowering to people who sometimes don't get a voice, particularly in this country where I'm very worried about what really gets through to the Australian people to make us all think about what's at stake, not only for Australia, but for our region. And we haven't mentioned climate change, which arguably is a bigger national security threat to our survival than anything else. So just search for War Powers Reform on those platforms, and a recording of this webinar will be posted to this website tomorrow. Gentlemen, Michael Sainsbury and Hugh White, thanks very much, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Quentin. Been great to be with you.
Good on you.